Think of e-commerce in India, and Flipkart is the first company that comes to your mind that catapulted India's startup ecosystem and made entrepreneurship what it is today. Hello, everyone. Welcome to my show, Curryup Startup Podcast, a podcast to spotlight Asian leaders, and this is your host, Priyanka Komala. Our special guest for today is investigative journalist with Mint, Mihir Dalal from Bangalore, India. His first book, Big Billion Startup, The Flipkart Story, is just out, and Mihir was gracious to come to our show to share insights on the book and life as a journalist back in India. Welcome to my show, Mihir.
Happy to be here, Priyanka.
Thank you, Mihir. It's been an absolute pleasure to connect with you, and congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
How does
Thank
it
you so much.
feel?
Yep, it's been yeah, it's a very new experience, obviously, and I'm really happy that it's just been about 3 weeks since we launched the book, and so far, the word of mouth about the book and the extensive press coverage, it's been very encouraging to see that.
I understand this is like the first big business book that's covering one of India's biggest startups.
You're right. I mean, this is probably the first extensive, in-depth biography of an internet startup in India. While there are other books on the startup space, they've been more bigger picture and more generic perspectives on the startup ecosystem. There are very few books that go really deep into a large startup and look at narrate the story of one specific company. Yeah, so from that point of view, it is probably the first book that does that.
That's a huge accomplishment. Congratulations again.
Thanks.
And before we delve deeper into your book, I want to give our audience a perspective about who Mihir is as a person. So, Mihir, you were born and brought up in Bombay, and I know you've lived for the last decade in Bangalore. Can you share a cultural tidbit for our global audience about both Bombay and Bangalore?
I mean, yeah, this is something that you notice in Bangalore immediately, especially if you've lived in Bombay. I mean, Bangalore is still. Uh, a, I mean, it's really not a big city as such. It often feels like it's a small city that's been forced to become a big city, and that is not okay with it. So the culture, the pace of life over here, it's very much. Much slower than Bombay. People are not very commerce driven over here compared with Bombay. Yeah, but Bangalore has its perks as well. I mean, the weather is just absolutely gorgeous over here for maybe like even 10 months of the year. And yeah, the standard of living is far higher than Bombay. The cost of living is far lower than Bombay. So yeah, so these are some differences between Bangalore and Bombay. But having said that, if you're in this, if you want to be part of the startup scene, then I mean, Bangalore is the place to be.
Yeah, Bangalore has become a hub for the ecosystem, and it's interesting to compare and contrast the culture of both the cities. So, thank you for that. So, which one is your favorite now, Mihir? Bombay or Bangalore?
So while I'm from Bombay, I cannot see myself living there because I think just daily life is such a grind over there, and it's just too expensive, and yeah, I think from that perspective, I do prefer Bangalore.
As a journalist with Mint, India's financial newspaper, Mihir, you've covered Flipkart and other internet businesses for more than 5 years. You have had stints with Reuters and CNBC TV 18. How do you see your life as a journalist?
Yeah, so that's that's a very interesting question because when I began my career, that was the middle of 2008. So that was really the peak of, I mean, the global economy was booming, and that was really the peak of pre-recession, a world order. And yeah, so I started my career at that time, and then 5 months after I joined, I became a journalist. The world went into recession, and things just completely changed after that. So then I worked at Reuters for about 3.5 years, and Reuters is a completely different news organization than most other news organizations. I mean, it's just so massive. It has a global presence. So the perspective that you get at Reuters is really unique. And then after 3.5 years over there, I joined Mint, and at that time, again, newspapers. were doing relatively okay, and especially in India, we haven't seen the kind of like the kind of destruction that the US newspaper industry has seen, for instance, that hasn't happened in India. And in 2012, certainly it was. I mean, most newspapers were thriving. So from there to now, again, it's been a sea change, because now the threat that is posed by the internet is starting to play out in a far bigger way. So yeah, I think being a journalist is really really challenging right now. Job security is questionable. Um, Even the kind of work that you have to do, the number of hours that you have to put in, everything is like, yeah, so it's just far more stressful right now, and in the recent past than it was. So yeah, so I think the newspaper industry is at a very interesting place in India. And I think over the next 5 years you will see a lot of changes, like say with newspapers going behind a paywall online, trying out different kinds of revenue uh, generating initiatives. So yeah, I think life for a journalist is going to get far more challenging over the next few years. So yeah, and while it is a bit exciting, because obviously that means that you have to learn new skills, and you have to really be on your toes all the time. It is also a bit terrifying. Yeah, so basically, like, interesting times ahead, for journalists in India.
I totally agree with you, Mihir. And we've seen this disruption in the US, and it's interesting to see how the business models for the Indian newspapers are going to evolve as well. It's very interesting when I look back at my childhood days. Young World was like a part of the Hindu newspaper that used to come every weekend, and that's how I started reading newspapers. So there's always this hook for for children, for adults to be connected to reading a physical newspaper. And even with all these digital advances, there are some things that are very nostalgic, and I'm curious to see how the Indian the newspaper ecosystem evolves as well
Yeah.
to make it relevant to the modern times.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of people, especially in the tech world, they had predicted that newspapers are going to die, and everything is going to go online. I don't think it's that simple, and it's certainly not going to happen anytime soon in India. But I think the industry will face a reckoning sometime soon, which means that newspapers will have to up their game in terms of the kinds of stories that they do, the way they present these stories. So, like, papers will have to change the way they function in order to thrive or even survive in this internet era.
That's a very interesting prediction and perfect segue to your book that's been recently launched. So, coming to your book, Flipkart is India's biggest startup. That there's no doubt about that, and was sold to Walmart. How did the idea of your book shape up?
Yeah, I've been writing on startups full time since 2014, and in 2015, the funding boom in India was at its peak, and generally there was a lot of euphoria around internet startups. So at that time, suddenly, both from the media side, as well as the publishing side, there was a lot of interest in doing books and stories on startups. So I was approached by a very large publishing house in 2015, and the person who approached me, he did not really have a specific idea in mind. So I pitched a book on Flipkart, but for some reason they were not excited about it at that time. And even I had my doubts, because the Flipkart story really hadn't reached a certain conclusion, and the direction of Flipkart was still not very clear. And besides, at that time, I was not even sure that I could deliver a book, because I had been used to writing about 1,000-word news articles, and to make the leap from news writing to doing a book, I mean, I just wasn't sure if I could do it. But then after the Walmart buyout, I think the Flipkart story had definitely reached a certain conclusion. And by this time, I had written several long form articles on Flipkart, and really gone deep into like inside the company and behind the scenes. So I felt confident that I could turn out a like a reasonable, like a reasonably decent book on this particular company, because I'd been tracking it for 4 years, and it had been the main subject of my coverage. So from my perspective, just my confidence around being able to take up such a project had increased. The Flipkart story had reached a conclusion, and at the same time the story was just so compelling that I felt that there would be substantial interest in such a book. And I mean, I was like proven right immediately, because after submitting the book proposal, within 10 days we had gotten offers and interest from five different publishing houses. So yeah, so that is how the book shaped up, really.
That's pretty cool. Everybody wants to be a part of your big story, right? Now that it's in the limelight and Flipkart is like all over the news. Stories like these, as you rightly mentioned, need to be very compelling, very riveting to catch the attention of the book readers. What were some of the things that ran in your mind as you were writing the story to make it that way?
There were just so many things. I mean, Flipkart is one of those companies, uh, whose day-to-day kind of functioning seemed to be, covered in newspapers. I mean, every day there would be 10, 15 stories on Flipkart for since 2014. So it was really a company that had received a lot of media coverage, but at the same time, I felt that there was very little that was actually known about the people behind Flipkart, as in including the Bansals. So while I was reporting on it, what shocked me was that while I'd covered the company for 4 years, I myself knew very little about the people behind Flipkart. So that was really the most interesting thing. I mean, some of the interesting tidbits about Sachin Bansal, who is the co-founder of Flipkart. Again, were very interesting. So he is someone who's a very radical internet entrepreneur. I mean, he is very, very bold, very audacious, big thinker, and he truly believes in Silicon Valley values. That you can uh, just transform the world using technology, and you really have to kind of think big, and believe in yourself and stuff like that. So for someone like him, who's such a who otherwise had adopted Silicon Valley values wholesale, so Sachin had actually had to stay back at IIT Delhi for 1 year to finish his course, because he had failed the first time. So he actually never admitted to this failure, because and I mean, then when one speaks to people, you realize that it's because the significance of the IITs is so big over here that even a guy like Sachin could not admit to relative failure. And if you look at people like Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, etc., I mean, these are basically like college dropouts, and there are quite a few famous entrepreneurs who did not even attend college. So things like these were like really very striking for me. I mean, and there are really like dozens of such things in the book. Yeah, so these are some of the personal anecdotes that were very striking for me.
Right, and the book sketches in detail about the Bansals, as you mentioned, Sachin and Binny Bansals, the entrepreneurs behind the big unicorn. The venture capitalists, the startup valuation stories, their exits. Can you walk us through your research approach? Because for stories like these, as you mentioned, a lot of people don't know the real people behind it, and some could be noise and speculation. So, how did you make sure you captured the real stories?
I conducted more than 250 interviews for the book, went through hundreds of newspaper articles, hundreds of their interviews, uh, uh, any video that is out there about them online. I poured through all these things, and then also going through a lot of regulatory documents that companies are required to file with the registrar of companies in India. So from the point of view of research, it was just kind of trying to get each and every base covered about the company and these people, and whatever there is there online, whatever has been written about that, I ensured that I went through all these things. And then I think it was once, so I started reporting on the book in August of last year. And by, I would say, late December, I had a certain idea of the book in mind. And then it was really about, just like plugging the gaps in my knowledge about the company. So I would say much of the reporting for the book was really over by, say, maybe late March. And then I had started writing the book in December. So the book, I finished my first draft by about June. So the book writing process was basically about 6 to 7 months, whereas the reporting, a bulk of it was over by March. And then I just kind of, conducted interviews to fix gaps in my knowledge. Yeah, so this is a bit about the process behind the book.
And you know what? You've covered this story for a very long time, right? Flipkart, at least for a few years. And as a journalist, I'm curious, how do you put your bias aside? Because you might have a perspective on Flipkart versus the stories that you're hearing as part of your research. So how do you tend to balance your own personal bias?
Yeah, again, that's that's a really interesting thing to experience actually, especially the whole personal bias part when you're writing such a book. Because I'd covered Flipkart for such a long time, so obviously you would have biases, but I think the most important part is to be aware of these biases, because I think it's really foolish to let yourself believe that you don't have any biases, because it's just not possible. I mean, there's no such thing as zero bias. So I think it's very important first to um, be aware of your biases, and then to construct a paradigm, or to have a set of metrics by which you judge events and people. And as long as you are true to these parameters that you have set, I think then it's completely fine. And so that is one way in which I ensured that my bias as such doesn't really creep into the book beyond those set parameters. I think the second thing was that you just try and understand and empathize with the people that you're writing about. So even if there was just so many different agendas over here within Flipkart that were at play, especially in the second half of the story. So for me, it was very important to understand, what was really driving all the major characters, and how were their ambitions and fears then kind of affecting the course of Flipkart. So I think once you try and empathize with all the major characters, I think that is another way to kind of ensure that the bias doesn't really creep in. And I think another thing that really helped me was that when I had conducted particularly explosive interviews, I would take some time out and just revisit these interviews after 4 or 5 days, so that I had some time to kind of reflect on it. And I also had some time away from the subject matter, because I think the like what happens is that after you've conducted a really interesting and explosive interview, you are just so excited that you sometimes do not see the complete picture. And then you end up getting influenced by that interview or by that person you've just interviewed. So I think that kind of distance really helps. So yeah, so these are some of the things that I did to ensure that my personal bias doesn't really creep in beyond these set parameters that I had designed at the start.
You've been very humble enough to open up into the journey that you've had as part of writing this book. So thank you for sharing that tidbit with our listeners here. What would you say are the main characters in your story?
So the main character is Sachin Bansal, who's the founder and was a CEO of Flipkart for a very long time. After that, and obviously the second main character would be Binny Bansal, who was his co-founder, and he also became Flipkart CEO in 2016. So these are the two main characters, and then there are in the second half of the book again. There's this guy Leaf Excel who was the main investor at Flipkart, who was the managing director of this New York-based investment firm called Tiger Global Management. So these three, along with Kalyan Krishnamurthy, who was an understudy to Leaf Excel at Tiger Global. So these four are the main characters as such, in that order. And then there are people who play an important role in certain parts of the book, but as far as the main characters are concerned, I guess you could say these four are those.
That's very interesting. And if you look back at the story of Flipkart, they started out as an online bookstore, right, with a very meager initial capital of 4 lakh rupees, around like 5,000 to 6,000 US dollars. And as you were covering the story, what do you think made them into the unicorn that they were as a competitor to Amazon, which prompted Walmart to come in and pick up this big company? How do you think they made this transition happen?
A complex story from that point of view, because there was no there was no like one such moment or something, but like there were a few key moments, like for instance, in 2008, so the Bansal started out in 2007, and in for the first 18 months, they were rejected by all the investors that they had approached. They were rejected by most of their acquaintances and classmates whom they had approached to join the company. They were, advised against doing an e-commerce venture by pretty much everyone they knew. So the first 18 months was really like was a very very difficult time for them. Was a period of just struggle and frustration and rejection. So after that, they somehow managed to convince a small investment firm to put up $1 million, and that too, that investment firm only agreed to do that in three tranches. So that was about the spring of 2009. And then a few months later, this guy Leaf Excel, who was a very young guy at that time, in his mid to late 20s, and then he was just kind of doing some, so he was interested in companies in emerging markets like India, internet startups in emerging markets like India. So he was just kind of Googling, names of books, just to figure out, which are the e-commerce companies in India that are out there. So every time he searched for a book, Flipkart's name popped up, and it was so he was just really surprised because he had never heard of Flipkart. And then on a whim, he just like wrote to them, and he got in touch, and then within 2 months, Flipkart had finalized an investment of $10 million, and that was just an astonishing deal for that time, because most startup deals at that time would take like at least 4 to 6 months to get completed. And you would not hear of someone sitting in the US who just decides to invest in a e-commerce company in India after just one or two calls and maybe one meeting with the founders of such a company. So I think that investment just completely transformed Flipkart, because after that, the Bansals just became so ambitious, and they were also so kind of encouraged that someone had finally seen what their vision was and what their ability was. Because while the first 18 months was a period of struggle for them, they had actually become really good at delivering excellent customer service. So just a sidetrack. So basically, Sachin and Binny had both worked at Amazon India before starting Flipkart, and over there, especially Sachin was just totally radicalized by Amazon's dogma of customer obsession. And when they started Flipkart, they started out with this idea that they would just delight their customers at whatever cost. So they'd actually become really good, at the actual business of e-commerce. And when the Tiger investment happened, that was really the validation that they needed. And they really never looked back after that. So that was one really key moment in their journey. And, after that, there were several other things, but from the point of view of their personalities, they were really both very, very introverted, very geekish, like typical engineers. So they were not really good at the operational part of e-commerce. So e-commerce at that time was all about dealing with courier partners, with logistics companies, with suppliers, with regulators, with basically, like, it was just a very, very like a very like it was a business where you had to really hustle and kind of get work done from people. It was not a pure tech business like, say, social networking or search engines. So over here, the Bansals are completely not equipped to do this. So and they realized that very quickly. So what they did was they hired a lot of smart, driven people who were good at these aspects, and they just let them loose. So I think they realized this early on, that for things that they are not good at, they should just hire smart people and not tell them what to do. Just kind of let them loose, give them independence, give them authority, make them feel like Flipkart is their company. So I think these are some things that really propelled Flipkart into like that crazy expansion mode that they entered from 2009 till 2016.
I totally agree on the customer obsession, right? Because over here in the US, Amazon is the first e-commerce company that comes to your mind, and anything that you need to purchase, it's Amazon is the first thing that you talk about.
Yeah.
How the Bansals had this experience of, how do you learn from these kinds of companies and using those experiences to build Flipkart. I think that's a great leadership trait over there. And I agree with you in terms of how do you complement your skills, right? If you lack in one, how do you hire smart people who can do that for you in an excellent way? And that was a great way of building teams and building the morale of the teams as well. So I'm just curious here, Mihir. Did you get a chance to interview the Bansals as part of your research?
Oh no. So both of them declined to participate for the book. I mean, I've interviewed them several times, both formally and informally. While I was, I mean, before the sale to Walmart, as part of my work at Mint. But both of them declined to participate for the book, and that really wasn't surprising, because the circumstances of their departures, from Flipkart were very, very controversial.
Dramatic?
Even when I had started working on the book, I did not really expect them to participate, in the book. So they declined to participate, but I had access to a lot of people who had played a very key role in building Flipkart. So, as I said, I conducted more than 250 interviews, and most of these interviews were with Flipkart employees. Yeah, so while the Bansals did not participate, I had access to a lot of the other key characters in the Flipkart story across 11 years that the company was an independent firm.
That's understandable. Have you given them a copy of the book post the launch?
No, not really. I mean, I'm not sure, what their reaction would be. So yeah, so I haven't really given a copy of the book to them.
You've known the founders, as you were covering for the Flipkart story over the last few years. Was there any surprising moment for you when you look back at your book writing journey? Something that you unveiled about, these people behind the story?
Yeah, absolutely. So, that whole, I mean, Sachin having to stay back for a year at IIT, that was one of the things. Another was, how they had come very close to selling Flipkart in less than a year of starting out, because they had been, they were so dejected that they had been, that they had not been able to raise capital, that they had not been able to, convince anyone to join them. So these were some of the moments in the early years. And again, there are many, many such moments throughout the book where, where basically there's just not public information that has been kind of uncovered in the book. Yeah, so apart from these two, I would say, like, not giving too much away, but like other key moments were, a lot of the internal drama between Sachin, Binny, Kalyan, and Leaf Excel. So, a lot of details about that had not been like even I did not know about these details. And then, of course, how the sale with Walmart was put together. I mean, there was just so much drama and so many last minute changes that happened. That it was kind of incredible that as big a deal as a 21 billion transaction was put together in such a dramatic way. Yeah, so these are some of the
Hmm.
things that really even surprised me, even though I'd been covering Flipkart for a while.
Hmm. So dramatic enough that it could soon be a motion picture, is what I understand.
Yeah, yeah. So again, that was really surprising for me. So that my agent basically, after I finished writing the book, my agent pitched it to this production house, and they just immediately agreed to buy the rights, the visual rights for the book. So I still don't know whether it's going to be a movie or a web series or a TV series. But yeah, I mean, we have sold the visual rights of the book.
That's pretty interesting. Congratulations. In a nutshell, Meher, why should people read this book?
So I would say, there are many reasons, but if I have to kind of, just say it very briefly, I would say that, a lot of people, in fact, most people in the startup world, in India, aspire to greatness. Uh, Anyone who aspires to greatness would want to read about the people who came closest to achieving it, which was the case with Flipkart and the Bansals. So I think that is a big, big draw. That this is the story. This is a classic story of a pioneer, of really building something massive in no time. So I think that aspect of the underdogs achieving their dreams and becoming like these big successes. I think that if you like these kind of stories, you would want to read this book.
So, Flipkart was an Indian story that put us into the limelight around the world post the Walmart acquisition. What are your two cents about the future of the Indian ecosystem, and how these big conglomerates or companies outside of India come and start acquiring our Indian companies?
Yeah, so that's a pretty complex situation because over here, I mean, while Flipkart is a big success story, it is also a bit of a bittersweet tale because I mean, once Flipkart had become a big company by 2014, the Bansals really wanted to create a 100 billion company, and they fell far short of doing that. So the sale to Walmart came as a big relief in a way, for Flipkart and its investors. So I think from that perspective, definitely, Flipkart is a missed opportunity because it could have been a far, far bigger company, and there is no way that selling out to um, anyone was a part of the plan until the very end. So I would say that while it was not the most desirable outcome, it was really a necessary one for Flipkart because if the sale to Walmart hadn't happened, there was it was it would be very it would be very difficult to see where the exit for Flipkart investors would come from. And yeah, so I think that is definitely one aspect, but I think in general, these kind of acquisitions, at least of this scale, are very, very rare, and they will continue to be very, very rare in India because Flipkart was really an exception in most ways. And I don't think any of the current companies have built a company that is as high quality and as ambitious and as uh, clean that Flipkart was. So it's very doubtful to see such a large scale exit happening in the Indian startup ecosystem for a while to come. I think in general about American or Chinese companies acquiring Indian startups. I mean, that one really has to see what the context is. I mean, for instance, if say a Google acquires a small company, I don't think it's that like it's not that big a development, but I think any space where there is scope for a company to establish monopolies or monopolistic positions. I think those kind of positions, I think you have to be very, very skeptical and concerned of. So I would say that any large acquisition, even if such a large acquisition happens, would have to be analyzed and investigated from the point of view of antitrust issues. Yeah.
Right, and that's where we love the work of investigative journalists like you, Mihir. So I hope you'll continue doing the great work that you've been doing.
Yeah, so now actually, Flipkart and Amazon have, I mean, they're pursuing very different strategies. So Amazon, like it does in the US, they basically just want to sell everything, and they want to be the everything store for everyone. Whereas Flipkart has decided that it's going to be very, very tactical about its approach, and they have identified three or four very, very important categories for them, and they are the biggest in these categories, and they're very happy to let Amazon win in the others. So I think, I think one of the Flipkart leaders said it very succinctly that Amazon stands for service, whereas Flipkart stands for value. So I think that is a pretty accurate encapsulation of what these two brands stand for in the minds of consumers.
That's very interesting, and I hope those values continue to coexist with the Indian ecosystem going forward as well. Thank you so much, Mihir, for those wonderful insights about the book and your life as a journalist. But before we let you go, we're going to have a fun rapid fire round.
Yeah.
Are you ready for that?
Yep. Yep.
Awesome. So I'll give you a word or a line, and you tell me the first thing that comes to your mind.
Yeah.
Role model?
Jurgen Klopp.
Okay. And who's this person? I'm just curious.
He is the coach of Liverpool.
Got it. So which one would you choose, being an author or a journalist?
Author.
What's your native language and one word to describe yourself in that language?
Gujarati. Saro.
And what does it mean?
It means nice.
What does happiness mean to you?
Not having to work for money and just pursuing what I want to do.
And here's a fun question. How do you unwind?
I read and I listen to music.
Well, that was Mihir Dalal. Mihir, it was such a pleasure having you on my show, Curryup Startup Podcast. And thank you for opening up and sharing a lot about your personal story and how you covered the Flipkart story. And any parting thoughts for our listeners?
I would just like to say that I hope there are more such books about Indian startups that come out, because there are some very compelling stories that have not been uncovered, and that deserve to be told. And yeah, please do pick up a copy of this book if you are interested in knowing about Indian businesses.
Right. It's one of the most compelling stories out there. And thank you, Mihir. We wish your book is a huge hit and continues to inspire a lot of Indian entrepreneurs and people across the globe to understand what it takes to be successful and the failures that come as part of it as well.
Yep. Thanks so much for having me here, Priyanka.